Hey everyone. It feels like every week in front-end development, there's like a new framework or a new library or a new something we're supposed to be using.
Yeah,
But today we're going beyond just like the hype cycle.
right.
We're diving deep into a structural shift that's kind of changing the game for large-scale applications.
Totally.
Micro front-end.
And it's a shift that's especially relevant for, senior developers or tech leads and architects
Right.
who are grappling with, the complexities of those massive front ends we've all seen kind of grow out of control.
Yeah, exactly. Think about it as your application grows, that like monolithic front-end
Yeah,
can become a real bottleneck.
absolutely.
It's like trying to renovate a house while everyone's still living in it.
Uh-huh. Yeah,
Micro-frontends kind of offer a way to break down that monolith into smaller, more manageable units,
right.
make it easier to develop, deploy, and scale.
And it's not just about making things smaller, though.
Yeah.
It's about creating a more decentralized and autonomous way of working, where teams can really own their specific parts of the application
Yeah.
and move faster independently.
So instead of having one giant team trying to coordinate every little change,
Yeah.
you have smaller, more focused teams that
Hmm.
can work in parallel,
Exactly.
choosing the best tools and technologies for their specific
Yes,
needs. That sounds like a dream,
it is.
especially for those of us who have spent countless hours
Yeah.
trying to wrangle a massive monolithic code base.
It can be a dream,
Yeah.
but it's important to understand that this newfound freedom comes with its own set of challenges.
Okay.
It's not just about splitting things up.
Right.
It's about managing the complexity
Uh-huh.
that comes with having multiple independent applications
Okay.
that need to work together seamlessly.
That's where things get really interesting.
Yeah,
We've all seen how separating concerns can help manage complexity.
absolutely.
How do you actually structure a micro front-end application
Right.
so that it doesn't descend into chaos?
So let's imagine like a familiar scenario.
Okay.
You're building an e-commerce platform.
Okay.
Instead of treating the entire front end as like a single entity,
Right.
you could break it down into smaller self-contained units,
Okay.
a header micro front end,
Okay.
a product catalog micro front end,
Okay.
a shopping cart micro front end, and so on.
Okay. I'm starting to visualize this.
Yeah.
So instead of one giant repository,
Yeah.
you'd have separate repositories for each of these micro front-ends, right?
Exactly.
Each with its own code base,
Yeah.
its own
Love that.
development environment, its own deployment pipeline.
Exactly. And then the magic happens when you bring these independent units together into a cohesive user experience.
Now, I'm guessing that magic involves some pretty clever techniques.
It does.
What are some of the key tools and concepts
Yeah.
that make this integration possible?
So one of the most powerful tools in our arsenal is module federation.
Okay.
Think of it as a way to share code and dependencies
Okay.
between micro frontends at runtime without tightly coupling them.
So instead of like copying and pasting code across different repositories,
Yeah.
which we all know is a recipe for disaster,
Yeah, definitely.
you can have these micro front-ends dynamically load and share modules from each other.
Exactly.
That sounds incredibly powerful, especially for things like common UI components
Yeah.
or like shared utility functions.
Absolutely. And thanks to tools like Webpack 5 and Vite,
Yeah.
implementing module federation has become much more accessible.
Yeah.
These tools provide the infrastructure for building, bundling, and serving micro frontends in a way that makes this dynamic composition possible.
This is where it gets really interesting for our listeners,
Yeah.
especially those who are already thinking about how they might apply this to their own projects.
Right.
If you're ready to start experimenting with micro front-ends,
Yeah.
how would you even begin setting things up?
So let's stick with our e-commerce example.
Okay.
You'd begin by setting up a container application.
Okay.
This container acts as the shell, the skeleton that holds everything together. It's responsible for loading and orchestrating the different micro frontends.
Okay, so the container app is like the conductor of the orchestra,
Yeah.
making sure all the different instruments play in harmony.
Exactly.
And then each micro front-end would be a separate project with its own development setup.
Precisely. And within each micro frontend's configuration, let's say you're using Vite,
Okay.
you define what modules it exposes to other micro frontends.
Exposes is a key term here, right?
It is.
It's about defining the public API of a micro front-end,
Right.
the parts that other micro front-ends are allowed to use.
Exactly.
And on the flip side, you'd also define what external modules a micro front-end needs to remote in.
Correct. Remote basically means importing functionalities from other micro-frontends.
Okay.
This is where the magic of module federation really shines,
Uh-huh.
enabling this seamless sharing of code and dependencies at runtime.
Now, we've talked about how micro-frontends can share code and stay independent,
Right.
but in a real application, they need to talk to each other.
Yeah.
How do you handle communication between these independent units?
There are different approaches, but one of the most popular and robust is publish-subscribe,
Okay.
a pattern for event-driven communication.
Okay.
Imagine a message board where micro-frontends can post messages or events,
Mm-hmm.
and other micro-frontends can subscribe to specific events and react accordingly.
Okay, I like that analogy.
Yeah.
It's like a decoupled way for these independent components to stay
Mhm.
in sync
Yeah.
without being directly aware of each other.
Exactly.
Can you give us a real-world example of how this publish-subscribe mechanism might play out in our e-commerce app?
Absolutely. So imagine a user adds an item to their shopping cart.
Okay.
This action within the shopping cart micro-frontend would trigger an event item added.
Okay.
The header micro-frontend, which displays the cart count,
Right.
will describe to this event and update the count accordingly.
So it's about sending and receiving messages.
Yep.
Based on user actions or other events within the application.
Right.
I know our listener has dealt with event-driven systems.
Yeah.
This is like that. But at the level of the application architecture,
It is.
it's a way to keep things in sync
Right.
without creating a tangled web of dependencies.
Exactly. And what's great about publish subscribe is that it allows for loose coupling between micro-frontends.
Okay.
They don't need to know about each other's internal implementations. They just need to agree on the events they'll be communicating through.
This is all fascinating stuff, but I have to admit it also sounds pretty complex.
Yeah.
Is this something that's only realistic for large organizations with dedicated platform teams?
Not necessarily. While micro-frontends are certainly powerful for large-scale applications,
Right.
they can also be valuable for smaller projects,
Yes.
especially if you anticipate future growth and want to build in flexibility and scalability from the start.
That makes sense. The ability to scale your team and your code base independently
Yeah,
could be a huge advantage as your application evolves.
exactly.
It's like setting yourself up for success down the road.
Exactly. And the beauty of micro-frontends is that they can be incrementally adopted.
Oh,
You don't have to go all in from day one.
Okay, that's reassuring. All right, let's get into like the nuts and bolts of actually building a micro front-end application.
Okay.
I'm ready to see this magic in action.
All right, so let's break it down.
Okay.
How you would set this up using a tool like Vite,
Okay.
which many in our audience will have used before.
Right.
First, you'd create your container application.
Okay.
This will be a simple project, likely using an HTML file as an entry point.
So if I'm picturing this right,
Yeah.
the HTML file would be pretty bare bones.
Yeah,
Just the essential structure, and then it would dynamically load the micro front-end.
exactly. You'd have a main div element where the micro frontends will be mounted.
Okay.
And instead of hard-coding script tags for each micro frontend,
Right.
you'd use JavaScript to fetch and execute them at runtime.
Okay, so the container app acts as a kind of orchestrator,
Yeah.
deciding which micro front-end to load based on the current route or user interaction.
Yes. Let's say you have a micro frontend for your product catalog
Okay.
and another for a user's profile.
Okay.
The container app would be responsible for figuring out which one to display
Right.
based on the URL or a user clicking a navigation link.
This is making more sense now.
Good.
But how do those micro front-ends actually get built and bundled?
That's where Vite comes in.
Okay.
You'd create a separate Vite project for each micro frontend.
Okay.
The beauty of Vite is that it supports module federation out of the box.
Oh, nice.
In your Vite config file, you would specify which modules your micro frontend exposes
Okay.
and which ones it remotes.
Okay, so let's walk through like a concrete example.
Okay.
Let's say our product catalog micro front-end needs to expose a component
Right.
that displays a list of products.
Yeah.
What would that look like in the Vite config?
So you would use the federated modules option in your Vite config.
Okay.
It would look something like this. You'd have export default defined config, and then inside of that you have plugins, and inside of plugins you have federation,
Yep.
and then name product catalog, file name, remote entry.js exposes, and then an object
Got it.
where the key is product list, And the value is .src components product list, .jsx,
Okay.
and then other federation options.
So we're giving our micro front end a name product catalog.
Yes.
And we're specifying a file name for the entry point,
Mm-hmm.
and then the expose section is where the magic happens.
Right.
We're saying that the module at .src components product list.jsx
Yes.
should be made available to other micro front ends under the name product list.
Precisely. Now, let's say our user profile micro frontend needs to use this product list component.
Okay.
In its Vite config, you would add a remote section.
Okay.
Similar to the last one.
Got it.
We have export default, define config, and then an object,
Right.
plugins, and then federation,
Right.
name user profile, file name remote entry.js, remotes, and then an object with a key of product catalog and a value of https://product-catalog.com/remote-entry.js
I see.
and other federation options.
We're basically telling the user profile, micro front end, where to find the product catalog's remote entry point,
Yeah,
which is the file that lists all the exposed modules.
correct.
And then within the user profile's code, we can simply import the product list component
Yeah,
like we would any other module.
exactly. It would look something like this: import React from React, import product list from catalog product list,
Okay.
const user profile, other code return div, other components, product list div.
This is so cool.
Yeah,
We're essentially composing our application from these independent modular pieces.
exactly.
And if the product catalog team decides to update their product list component,
Right.
the user profile micro front end will automatically get the latest version.
That's the power of module federation. It
Yeah.
allows for truly independent development and deployment.
Wow.
Teams can work on their micro frontends in isolation, and as long as they respect the agreed upon interfaces, everything will work seamlessly together at runtime.
This raises an interesting question.
Yeah.
How do you ensure consistency across different micro front ends,
Right.
especially in terms of like styling and user experience?
That's one of the key challenges of micro frontends.
Okay.
You need to have clear guidelines and strategies for maintaining consistency.
Right.
One approach is to have a shared design system
Okay.
or a component library that all micro frontends can use.
Right.
This ensures that things like buttons, inputs, and typography look and behave the same way across the application.
I'm thinking back to our listener and their experience.
Yeah.
They've probably seen a lot of UI inconsistencies creep in over time as an application grows.
Yeah, definitely.
This approach seems like it could be a really valuable way to tackle that challenge.
Yeah.
Is there a downside to all of this?
So one potential challenge with micro frontends is performance.
Oh.
If you're not careful, you could end up with an application that's slow and clunky because it's loading multiple bundles of code.
Right. If each micro front end is loading its own set of dependencies,
Yeah,
you could end up with a lot of duplicated code being downloaded by the browser.
exactly. That's why it's important to think carefully about code splitting,
Right.
caching strategies, and other performance optimizations.
Okay.
One technique is to lazy load micro frontends only when they're needed.
Okay.
So, for example, the user profile micro frontend wouldn't be loaded until the user actually navigates to their profile page.
And I imagine tools like Webpack and Vite have built-in mechanisms for code splitting and optimization,
They do.
so you don't have to reinvent the wheel.
And there are also techniques like prefetching,
Okay.
where you can start loading a micro frontend in the background as the user is interacting with another part of the application.
Right.
This can make the transition between micro frontends feel much smoother and faster.
So it's about finding that balance between modularity and performance.
Yeah.
Sounds like there are a lot of knobs and levers you can adjust
There are.
to optimize the user experience.
Yeah.
What about communication between micro front ends? We talk about publish subscribe,
Yeah.
but are there other approaches?
You can use custom events,
Okay.
shared state management libraries, or even direct function calls.
Okay.
If you need more fine-grained control,
Right.
the choice often depends on the specific needs of your application
Right.
and the complexity you're comfortable with.
It sounds like there's a lot of flexibility
There is.
in how you can architect and implement micro front ends.
And that's part of what makes it such an exciting space.
Yeah.
It's not a one-size-fits-all solution. It's a set of principles and techniques
Right.
that can be adapted to different contexts and challenges.
We've covered a lot of ground today,
Yeah, we have.
from the conceptual underpinnings of micro front ends
Right.
to some practical techniques for setting them up and
Yeah.
managing their complexity.
Exactly.
What are some common misconceptions you encounter when people are first learning about micro front ends?
So one common misconception is that micro frontends are only for massive applications. with hundreds of developers.
Right.
While they can certainly help tame the complexity of large projects,
Right.
they can also be valuable for smaller teams and projects,
Okay.
especially those with a long-term vision and an expectation of growth.
It's about choosing the right tool for the job.
Yeah,
And sometimes a monolithic front end is perfectly adequate.
absolutely.
But for projects with a certain scale and complexity,
Right.
micro front ends offer a powerful alternative.
Yeah.
I think your listener knows that after all, they came to us for this deep dive.
Another misconception is that micro-frontends require a complete rewrite of your existing application.
Right?
That's not true at all. You can incrementally adopt micro-frontends,
Right.
starting with a small part of your application,
Okay.
and gradually migrating more functionality as needed.
So you can dip your toes in the water
Yeah,
without having to dive in head first.
exactly.
That's reassuring to hear.
Yeah.
What are some of the key takeaways you'd want our listener to remember from this technical deep dive?
I think the most important thing is to understand that micro-frontends are more than just a technical architecture.
Okay.
They represent a shift in mindset towards building more modular,
Right.
scalable, and team-friendly applications.
It's about embracing the idea that we can build complex systems by composing smaller independent units
Yeah,
that work together harmoniously.
absolutely.
And as we've seen,
Yeah,
there are powerful tools and techniques available to help us achieve this.
totally.
Yeah, I think that's a powerful insight. It's not just about the tech. It's about the philosophy of building software in a way that embraces modularity and flexibility and team autonomy.
Exactly. And when you start thinking about software development in those terms, it opens up all sorts of possibilities. You can have teams working independently, deploying new features and updates on their own schedule without stepping on each other's toes.
And for senior developers, tech leads, and software architects, that means you're no longer the bottleneck.
Right.
You can empower your teams to move faster and more autonomously
Yeah.
while still maintaining control over the overall architecture and vision of the application.
It's about moving from a command and control model of development to a more collaborative and decentralized one.
Right.
And I think that's a positive shift for the industry as a whole.
I agree, but I'm also wondering,
Yeah.
with all this autonomy, how do you make sure everyone is rowing in the same direction?
Right.
How do you prevent things from becoming too fragmented?
That's a valid concern. Communication and collaboration become even more critical in a micro front-end architecture.
Okay.
You need to have clear guidelines, strong communication channels, and a shared understanding of the overall goals and principles of the application.
So it's not just about throwing things over the fence to different teams and hoping for the best.
Right.
You still need to have a cohesive vision
Yeah,
and a clear process for working together.
absolutely.
What advice would you give to a team that's considering adopting micro front ends for the first time? What are some of the key things they should be thinking about?
First and foremost, I'd recommend starting with a clear understanding of the business goals and user needs that the application is trying to address.
Okay.
This will help you define the boundaries of your micro front ends and ensure that they're aligned with the overall product strategy.
Okay, so it's not just about breaking things down arbitrarily.
Right.
It's about understanding the domain and the user flows,
Yeah,
and then designing your micro front ends around those concepts.
exactly. And once you have a clear understanding of your domain, you can start thinking about the technical aspects.
Mhm.
Which technologies are you going to use?
Right,
How are you going to handle data sharing and communication between micro front ends?
right.
What are your deployment and monitoring strategies?
These are all important considerations.
They are.
And it sounds like there's no one-size-fits-all answer.
That's right. There's no silver bullet, but there are certainly best practices and patterns that you can learn from and adapt to your own context.
And that's where the community comes in, right?
Absolutely.
There are so many resources available online, from blog posts and tutorials to open source projects and community forums.
The micro front-end community is very active and supportive, and by sharing our experiences and learning from each other, we can continue to evolve and improve this approach to building software.
So for our listener who's feeling inspired to dive into the world of micro front ends,
Yeah.
what are some practical next steps they can take?
Okay.
What are some good resources for learning more and getting started?
There are several excellent books and articles available that provide a comprehensive overview of micro front-ends. I would also recommend checking out the documentation for tools like Webpack 5 and Vite, which are essential for building and deploying micro front-end applications. And of course, there are countless examples and tutorials available online. Just search for micro front-ends on GitHub and you'll find a wealth of resources.
Excellent. And I know there are some great conferences and meetups dedicated to micro-frontends as well. It's definitely a growing and evolving space. I think we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive.
We have.
From the fundamental principles of micro-frontends to some practical tips for getting started.
Right.
I feel like we've equipped our listener with the knowledge they need to make informed decisions about whether this approach is right for them.
I agree, and I hope we've inspired them to explore this exciting new frontier in front-end development.
If you're feeling inspired to take the next step, we highly recommend checking out the resources we mentioned in this deep dive. And don't forget to subscribe to Pragmatic Reviews on YouTube, hit that like button, and leave us a comment letting us know what you thought of this episode. We love hearing from you.
Yeah.
Until next time, happy coding.